hit to AI. So I thought we could just start by introducing ourselves, and we're going to be talking about empathy. We both have done a lot of work on empathy, and then maybe talk about definitions of empathy and kind of anything else kind of on our mind.
Yeah, sounds
Sound
good to
good?
me.
Well, I
Yeah,
can
absolutely.
start. I'm Edwin Rutsch. I'm the director of the Empathy Center. So I've been for about 15 years been working on this topic of empathy, and not from an academic point of view, really, but more kind of as a practitioner, I'd say. And working our center, the Empathy Center's mission is to kind of build an empathy movement to make mutual empathy a primary cultural and social value. And we've done all kinds of different projects, hundreds of interviews, probably like 400 interviews on the topic of empathy over the years. We have some trainings of the practice called the Empathy Circle practice that we do. We had a center in Santa Barbara that kind of fell through. It was like the Empathy Center, and we have different chapters, around of groups that do kind of this empathy work with the Empathy Center, and we've had an empathy tent that we've taken out to public spaces where we offer listening, active listening, empathic listening, kind of at the street level, and just all kinds of different projects. Just kind of exploring everything we can do to kind of raise the level of mutual empathy in society. So that's a little bit about myself. And
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm Craig. I'm a postdoctoral fellow currently at the University of California, San Diego. I'm working in the Rady School of Management with Dr. Chris Ovius. I've been studying empathy since my master's back in 2018, where I started a project where I used experience sampling to look at how people experience empathy in their everyday lives. Um, and from there, I've kind of continued to work on different aspects of empathy. And these days, I'm sort of looking at how I'm developing this idea of what I call like wise empathy. So that's sort of morally grounded excellence in socio-emotional problem solving, you might call it. So it has to do with this idea of regulating different parts of empathy depending on the context, with the aim of improving the well-being of the empathizer and the target of empathy. So I think I think there's a lot of overlap between, sort of the ways that I'm thinking about this and what you folks are doing with like holistic empathy and empathy circles and things like that. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about in that domain. In terms of defining empathy, that's always a tricky one in this space, and I know you're doing a lot of work to try to figure out how to define it in a robust way. I tend to think about it. Um, I'll often define it in one line as like the process of understanding, sharing, and caring about the emotions of other people. So that is kind of this. That interpersonal sort of focus that you've pushed back against, which I think is a good place to push back against. Um, yeah, so it sort of has these three pieces to it, that kind of affective emotion sharing piece, that sort of cognitive perspective taking, seeing things from their point of view piece, and then that sort of motivational compassion, empathic concern piece to it. And yeah, so I think one reason I think there's value in like thinking about it from that perspective as well is in a context like an empathy circle or in a context like Carl Rogers was thinking about where you're in therapy or even in a conversation like this, it's empathy is really an interpersonal construct. It's a process, right? That takes place between two or more people. And it's important to have that sort of interpersonal perspective. And that's one area of like on the academic side that needs more work done. Alexandra Main has some good stuff on this, on like relational empathy, stemming from work by like Aaron Halperin and folks. Um, but I do think there is, at times, we're flooded with stimuli that we have to interpret in an interpersonal way. So it might be like news or social media posts or things like that, where there's not this interpersonal, dynamic, and it's just like, okay, I have to engage with this emotional stimuli, and I'm from another person, and I'm understanding, sharing, or caring about their perspective, and how do I regulate that myself? So I see that as like an important goal to like understand how the empathizer has that process and can regulate that process and maintain their well-being while dealing with, the flood of stimuli that they
Mhm.
engage with in the world. And then I think an important direction to get more understanding that's been less focused on in the empathy research is how is empathy received? How the target of empathy, how are they affected by what empathizers do? Um, so yeah, there's I think what's missing from my definition is that behavioral piece. And I sort of think about that as maybe like high quality listening or like pro-social behavior can be motivated by empathy. So I see it all as connected, but it's just a matter of where you draw your lines kind of thing.
Yeah. So, well, with it sounds like you're talking about the relational part too. Like empathy is a relationship, and that's what the definition that I've been working on is the whole what I call the holistic
Mhm.
empathy definition. I don't know if you had a chance to see
I
the
did.
video, so I tried to lay it out there. That I find that in psychology and so forth, it tends to be more individually oriented
Hmm.
empathy, looking at it from an individual, empathizing with another person or so,
Hmm.
and not sort of taking in that it's a relationship, that we're in a relationship.
Hmm.
And the definition, as I've been sort of what I've been building on is really the work of Carl Rogers,
Hmm.
as you saw in the video or in the presentation. So his work was based on, in the therapeutic world, he would listen to his clients and just for a whole hour, just actively listen to them, reflecting back, staying present with them, reflecting back what they were sharing with him. And with the idea that you just listen to people and they can kind of figure out most of their problems if somebody listens and supports them. And so with the work I've done, I've sort of built on his work in that making it mutual. Because in
Hmm.
the therapeutic context, you tell a therapist, "Oh, you should have this. You should teach your client, how to listen and listen to you too, to make it a mutual,
Right.
empathy." And client and therapist, I can't do that. I'm getting money for this,
Right.
you know. So, but
Yeah.
I think that's the fullness of empathy, and even I thought Rogers and um, what's his name? Can't remember that. He's an Israeli I thou relationship, person that saying you can never get to a real I thou relationship in
Mhm.
therapy because it's not a mutual relationship. So that's kind of the work we've been doing is building on that active listening, but making it mutual and doing it in small groups and having that be sort of the cauldron of the beginning, sort of a minimal viable structure for holding mutual empathy and sort of building from there. And I'm also a bit of a crusade against the affective and cognitive empathy model because I think, as you saw in the presentation,
Yeah.
it seems too confusing. It's not sexy. It's like, it's when you talk to lay people, about it, and it's such technical terms, affective and cognitive. It kind of yeah creates some it's just not like it's just not sexy. And also I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of inconsistencies with it, even within the model.
Hmm.
People are kind of using the term a little bit differently. So yeah, so that's kind of
Yeah.
like the basics of and then I'm also adding self-empathy. And as I showed in the presentation, Rogers didn't talk about self-empathy, but he sort of addressed it a little bit, about that if somebody listens to you, it gives you more of a chance to sense into your own personal experience, which is what people like Marshall Rosenberg, and others, I think, call self empathy.
Mhm.
And then kind of splitting cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is usually perspective taking and imagining, and
Mhm.
having that be a separate, calling it imaginative empathy, which I think is a sexier term. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
so yeah, yeah. So that's
Yeah.
a bit of the framework that I'm coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really great. I mean, there's a few things there. So yeah, like I think as you point out, the therapeutic relationship is sort of a special one, but also a very specific one. So, it's one-sided by design, where the therapist is in a role to try to resolve the client's kind of presenting concerns. But most of our relationships aren't like that. They're more friendships or different types of relationships where we sort of it's more bi-directional, and we have that sort of at different times we'll maybe play that role for each other, um, or even within the same conversation, turn taking sort of thing. So I think I agree with a lot of what you're talking about. Um, the cognitive affective distinction as well. I think is overly simplistic. Now, I do think that like they can be differentiated, but what I found is that they tend to go together most of the time. So, like in my own data, I found that like 75% of the time that people report experiencing empathy, they report that they share their emotions, they take their perspective, and they feel compassion for them. So it's like all of these things, though we can differentiate them as academics and we can point out, they're associated with different brain structures and different tasks and things like that. They actually tend to go together when people experience empathy most of the time. Um, Now, they also can be associated with different outcomes. And this is sort of a key sort of insight for me that I found is like, especially when you're talking about negative emotions, which we're often talking about with empathy, is that it's a response to negative emotions. That emotion sharing piece can be dangerous for the empathizer, especially if they're not able to regulate it. I think that's where like the self-empathy piece can be really helpful, or Kristen Neff would call it like the self-compassion piece. But I think the self-empathy thing is doing something a little bit different from self-compassion, which is that like sort of insight into the self that you get from being listened to, where you can kind of explore your thoughts and feelings and gain a deeper understanding of yourself. I think that's what I'm sort of getting from this idea of self-empathy, which I think is cool. Um, but even just the sort of self-compassion, like being mindful of negative emotions, being kind to the self, recognizing common humanity, as like Kristen Neff would talk about, can come in handy with trying to share these negative emotions. But I think it's also worth pointing out that, most of the time, more often we're engaging with positive emotions from other people. As humans, we feel positive emotions more often, and as empathizers, we engage with positive emotions more often, maybe like 3 times as often. I've found in some data. So that risk of emotion sharing that folks have pointed out, it doesn't seem to be there when you're engaging with positive emotions. Um, so yeah, part of what I've been encouraging folks to do is like regulate your emotion sharing to focus on compassion for negative emotions, but to focus on feeling what they feel and savoring that and celebrating it like appreciative joy when you're engaging with positive emotions, and sort of maintaining a focus on the other rather than the self. Um, and I think that's something Carl Rogers would talk about as well. Is this other focus so that you're not having a self-focused personal distress response. On the flip side, you're not having a self-focused upward comparison response that something good is happening for the other person. And what does that mean about how bad of a person I am? Um, so yeah, that's sort of some of my reaction to your framework here.
Well, with the definition, a big part of it is grounding it in the empathy circle. So the
Mm,
empathy circle is usually, four, five, six, seven people in a circle, and we can have any topic. Could be just whatever's on your mind, or it could be something like what are anxieties and fears you're dealing with in your life, or what are celebrations you're dealing with, or pretty much just any topic that you want to bring into the circle. And we always say it's also whatever's on your mind. So
mhm,
anything that's sort of arising in your awareness and consciousness, feel free to share that. So we have turn taking. So one person is speaking, they select their listener. So I would select you as a listener, and I would be
mhm,
sharing, what's just on my mind, and then you reflect back your understanding of what I've said, which is basically active listening that Carl Rogers would do. But we have time turns, so you have 5 minutes, 6 minutes to share, You share a little bit, you pause, you get a reflection of what 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 I would be understanding you to be saying, and then you would check is did I understand you, or if not, then you say it in other terms until you feel heard and understood to your
Mm,
satisfaction. And then we go until you don't have anything else to say or the 5 minutes is up. And
mm,
then at that point, uh, me as a listener would then select someone else in the group to speak to, and then I would share with them, and we'd continue that process, for an hour and a half, 2 hours, or however much time we set for the group. And
mhm,
so we're taking that active listening that Carl Rogers did, but bringing it into a relational terms. And I find as a container that is it's sort of the minimal viable product.
mm,
If you're looking at like creating a structure that it's so if you're sharing, you were saying negative emotions, you're saying, oh, I'm feeling really depressed about something. And I reflect back, I'm hearing you're feeling depressed. And
mhm,
by me just listening to you, create space, my presence creates space for you to go deeper into your experience and sense more deeply into your experience. And so I'm empathizing. And so empathy is the sense of is sensing into your experience,
mhm,
and the reflection, active listening, is just a kind of a crutch that kind of
mhm,
helps that process to stay present, not bring in judgments, not bring in all the other things that could be a block, like detachment
mhm,
or trying to put you down, or
mhm,
one upmanship, or saying, oh, I had that same experience. I
mhm,
have to stay present with you to be able to reflect back what you're saying. And in the process, as I listen to what's on for you, is alive for you, you actually get to sense more deeply into yourself. It creates
mhm,
space for you to explore, without having to, compete for attention. And so there's
mhm,
sort of a self-empathy component in that. So you could be talking about a negative emotion. I would just reflect back, and you would explore the negative emotion. If it's a positive emotion, oh, I had a great day. I just got a job promotion. I'm so excited. So yeah, I'm hearing you're really excited. You got a job promotion. You're just feeling really good. And then you kind
mhm,
of explore that experience. And while the act of listening is sort of a crutch, I've had where we do it for, at least in conflict mediation in my family and other places. You go a couple hours, and then everybody's so attuned,
mhm,
empathically attuned to each other. You don't even need the crutch of the active listening. The
mhm,
spirit, the energy of presence is so embedded into the relationship that it creates a very beautiful, kind of a connection where
mhm,
everyone feels heard and connected. You don't even have to do the active listening anymore. So, and then I wanting to that sort of a direct empathy, which is what Carl Rogers, called empathy, just that direct sensing into someone else's experience, and
mhm,
then he sort of hinted at the self empathy. But there's the cognitive empathy, is sort of a more imagination. I can
mhm,
imagine what's going on for you. I can imagine myself being in your situation, or myself, you in your situation, or myself in your situation.
yeah,
But I could be right or wrong, right?
right.
That's the problem with imagination.
Mhm,
Is it's a good you learn a lot, you can gain a lot of insights, but with the active listening, you're checking, am I right or wrong in
mhm,
terms of hearing you, and that's sort of the more of the direct empathy. So yeah, so
yeah.
that model of the empathy circle is sort of a starting point, so we can keep from getting too abstract. Like,
Mhm,
let's bring whatever your definition is, or your component.
mhm,
How does Kristen Neff's self compassion, self care, which is you're caring, have a
mhm.
sense of care for yourself. How does that fit into the empathy circle?
Right, right. Yeah, I think there seems to be like a couple things kind of embedded in the process. Um, that you're laying out there. So like one thing that people have talked, or one term that I sort of think is interesting that people have talked about is like perspective getting, which it
Mhm.
sounds like is something that you're doing with the active listening when you reflect back and ask, have I
Yeah.
captured this correctly?
Mhm.
Um, and that's, that comes from this idea of like perspective mistaking, where we might do this imagination process, either the like imagine self or imagine other sort of perspective taking that we might engage in, but we might get it wrong. And in fact, sometimes perspective taking increases our confidence that we understand the other person's perspective, but it doesn't actually increase our accuracy about their emotion. Um, so we can get this wrong, and doing that act of like reflecting it back, what your understanding of what they're feeling and going through, and checking with them is seems like a really good practice. And it also brings up this idea of that again, Alex Main talked about of relational empathy, which involves this process of curiosity. So it's kind of beyond empathic accuracy, where empathic accuracy is like correctly identifying the emotion that they're feeling. But going beyond that and using curiosity to understand why they're feeling that way and what's driving that experience and what's the background for it. And um, yeah, and I do think that sort of gives people, there's some work suggesting that when you know the source of your own emotions, it's easier to deal with them. And I think oftentimes we don't necessarily know why we're feeling a certain way. Oftentimes we don't even realize we're feeling a certain way. Um, so having that space that you talk about creating for someone to explore how they're feeling and then find, okay, this is what I'm feeling. And now that I can talk about this a little more, this is why I'm feeling it. And that gives you sort of that self-empathy insight. Um, yeah, I do. I wonder if you could say a little bit more. I guess is it just sort of like a rebranding step to do the imaginative empathy as opposed to perspective taking? Uh, is that, or do
Yeah,
you,
there's
is,
two. I think it was Graham who was right. Was doing. I can't remember. Yeah, there's about this perspective getting.
mm,
In fact, he's trying to get I think he wrote about. I don't know if you're referring to him. I just saw his talked to him recently,
mm,
and the person he was trying to get away from imagination as listening. I mean, as
mm,
empathy, which is I'm putting it into a separate category, imaginative empathy, to separate it from the direct sensing into someone's experience,
mhm,
which is actually, I think the phenomenologists would actually call that empathy, and
mm,
Rogers would call that empathy.
mhm,
So, yeah. So I think you're saying rebranding, perspective taking, perspective taking as imaginative empathy, or I think cognitive empathy. There's all these different terms for the same
yeah,
phenomenon.
yeah,
It gets a
exactly.
little
Yeah,
confusing, but
for sure.
separating that. So I don't know if I think I might have lost the thread a little bit about. I mean, you were talking. One thing you were talking about was curiosity.
Mm,
So, I mean, when I listen to you, I have a real curiosity, and it's a pleasure. Like there's a feeling of pleasure to learn, to experience what your experience is.
mm,
And so I think that's like a motivation for the empathy for the empathy is just the pleasure of exploring some. It's knowing that if I'm listening to someone, I'm contributing to their well-being, so I feel good about that. And I
mhm,
also have a curiosity of what their worldview is, and to be able to learn from their worldview. So that was part of what you were talking about, was the curiosity part,
mm.
and the other was I think I wasn't quite sure. Was it the imagination? Something about them?
Yeah, I think you touched on it because the first part I think was like um, just a different term for what you're talking about with checking the understanding using active
Hmm.
listening, which it was like perspective getting. Um, yeah,
Which
so
I'm
I
calling
think
basic empathy, just
right,
sensing into
right.
someone's experience, and that, yeah. So yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So um, yeah, so basic empathy, like it seems to sort of encompass what academics would split off, which resonates with my work in the sense that these things tend to all go together when people actually have a real experience.
Hmm.
Even in like neuroscience studies, if you they'll talk about how you do a emotion sharing task and it lights up one area of the brain, you do a perspective taking task, it lights up another. But as you get more ecologically valid tasks, it tends to activate a more intermediate network
Hmm.
that involves like pieces of both of those. Um, so yeah, I think it makes sense to think about it in that way. I guess it just depends on like levels of analysis in some ways. Like if you're looking at you know in the population of different experiences of empathy and how they relate to outcomes, and that's where I sort of am trying to marry these two perspectives where like okay, emotion sharing when you're engaging with negative emotions or feeling what others feel when you're engaging with negative emotions can be bad for you. But compassion tends to be good for you when you're engaging with
Hmm.
negative emotions. But yet they all tend to go together when you have experiences of empathy. So it's not a zero sum thing where it's like to have compassion, don't ever feel what they feel. It's like noticing and accepting that you're feeling what they're feeling, putting the focus on the other person and like gently redirecting your focus to the compassion that's motivating you to engage with the other person's emotion. Um, and it seems to me like that can be protective for the empathizer, but it also seems like it can be good for the target as well. I'm working with some dyadic data right now that is looking at like perceived responsiveness of the target of empathy and just like bringing strangers into the lab and having them disclose a meaningful, either positive or negative emotional event, and having the other person be a listener. And then having them switch roles and sort of disclose. And then we look at how the listener has these different dimensions of empathy that they experience, and the sharer has talks about how responsive the other person was from like their perceived partner responsiveness sort of idea. Uh, so I think that it seems that the what I found is good for the empathizer. It also seems to be good for the target, which is good news from my perspective. So when you really share the positive emotions of another person, that gives them a chance to capitalize on those positive experiences, right? So
Hmm.
celebrating your positive experiences with another person, as you were saying, I see that you're feeling joy and you're feeling good about that. And like especially if someone has like an enthusiastic response to your positive emotion, like an active constructive response, they call it, that gives you the chance to really capitalize on it and above and beyond having the positive event occur itself, it's good for you. Um, and that can like strengthen the relationship between the two people. So that like positive emotion sharing or positive, feeling the positive emotions the other person are feeling, that seems to encourage that enthusiastic response. If you're happy and that makes me really happy, and then I respond to your happiness, I'll do it in an enthusiastic way, as opposed to if I'm like, okay, I need to focus on compassion because I know that, emotion sharing can lead me astray. So I'm going to focus on compassion and be like, I really care that you're feeling happy. It's not that enthusiastic, right? It's like maybe a passive constructive response. But yeah, when it does seem to be okay for the target when you focus on compassion for negative emotions, where maybe you feel a little sad that they're feeling sad, but you don't allow that to uh, take the forefront and you don't focus on your own feelings of sadness. You sort of are like, oh, that's really too bad that you're feeling that way. I hear that you're feeling sad, and you keep the focus on the other person and expressing
Hmm.
care for the other person. So,
Yeah, care and presence, and that's
mm,
if we bring it into the empathy circle, right?
yeah.
If I'm feeling uh, very sad and depressed, and you're listening to me, and you have different, you have choice of what you can say. You can say, "Oh, I hear you feel depressed and really sad. You've stayed present with me," versus like, I feel so sorry for you. It depends. It's like what would be in an empathy circle? What would be the self? What would be the compassionate response? Like I
Mm,
care about you. I feel sorry for you. You know what I'm saying? It's like what is the compassionate response in that situation? The empathic response would be you're just saying, "Hey, I hear you're feeling really sad and in pain, and then I just say, yeah, I can feel the pain down here deep in my chest, and it's just kind of growing and taking up, more of my awareness, and it happened because of this, and you're just staying present with me. Whereas the compassion can't, if it's in a sort of a sympathetic compassion, can actually take the response, the attention back to you about you feeling sorry for me instead of
Mm-hmm.
staying present with uh, with the journey I'm on, the emotional journey. I think Rogers also defined empathy as going on somebody else's journey with
Right.
them, right?
Right.
So it's like so it really depends on, yeah, I would love to see how compassion or self-compassion relates to that
Mm-hmm.
situation.
Mm.
If it's like, you're the listener, and then it's like, oh, I'm starting to feel really depressed. I have to worry about myself now and be self-compassionate and hold my, heart or whatever. Then you've
Mm.
kind of left your presence with
Right.
you. You're not no longer present with me. So that's why I try to bring it into in the empathy circle, so we can get really specific, about
Yeah.
what we're experiencing. And what you're talking about, the dyadic, I think is really curious about that, because it seems to build on, the empathy circle kind of builds on that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think from my perspective, having like feeling compassion and focusing on compassion for the other person, it wouldn't necessarily dictate what the response should be. The response is sort of the next step to me. Um, so it's like it may be saying something like, "Oh, I feel really sorry for you," but it might also just be like it motivates the desire to help the other person. So then what do you do to help the other person? Is sort of a separate question in some ways. Now that piece about like self-compassion and needing to guard the heart and sort of withdraw, that's where I think where like personal distress, so some classic work back in the day by Batson saying that, when people feel personal distress, they want to avoid the situation, they want to escape. But when they feel empathic concern, they'll engage. So that's part of what motivates this like focus on compassion for me is like focusing on the other person and caring about them and desiring to help them without resonating or ruminating with their negative emotions really strongly, which especially if you're not able to regulate those negative emotions becomes personal distress, which is like this self-focused, um, I need to withdraw. I need to like deal with my own emotions. This is too much for me. Um, so, but yeah, I mean, I think because the literature hasn't focused as much on how is empathy received, what do empathizers do when they're feeling, when this process happens, what do they actually do? We're starting to kind of move in that direction, I think. Um, but yeah, I would hope that, or not, I would suspect that oftentimes when people are focusing on compassion, they're keeping the focus on the other person and engaging with them in a way that they try to help them. And obviously, people can misfire uh, with what they do. Yeah, but I was trying to think back to something you'd said previously. Um, anyway, maybe it'll come back to me.
Yeah, well, there was
Yeah.
that sense when you say compassion. For me, I don't use the word compassion much because it's such a there's just like empathy. It's so confused what people
Yeah.
mean, but maybe a sense of care. So if I'm
Mm,
talking about in the empathy circle, I'm talking about a difficult situation. You
mm,
have a sense of care, like I
mm,
care about your well-being and what you know, how you're doing. And I would say that the actual listening is a very strong positive action. And it's
mm,
probably one of the most beneficial things that can be done when someone is in distress, especially if they're in distress. I mean, that's what, suicide helplines are all about, is
mm,
just listening to the person, being present, letting them know that they're not alone,
mm,
and let them talk about whatever is sort of going on for them and
mm,
accompanying them on their journey. And that sense of somebody's there, I'm not alone, keeps people from committing suicide. And
mm,
and I would say that just taking part in the empathy circle is an act of care. And I sometimes say it's microdosing love,
Mm, hmm.
because there's a little bit of love in that, that you're willing to sit with some others and listen to them. And that sense of care can grow as you learn more about why I might be depressed, the whole constellation of feelings and thoughts and situations, that you develop more care for the person, because you just start seeing their humanity, their humanity. And say, that's kind of like I can, that's kind of like could be me.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
like, so I don't, yeah. So that's how the sort of the care comes in. And then
Mm,
in terms of, like, we do conflict mediation, like we've taken our empathy tent out to like political rallies
yeah.
where the political right and left are like, knock down, drag out, bloody fights.
Hmm.
And we set up the empathy tent and we say to both sides, come in, we'll listen to you. And then we do conflict mediation as
Yeah.
well. And so if you can get people together to listen, and like especially actively listen to each other, it just they start creating a sense of connection with each
Mhm.
other, and kind of understanding. And there was one documentary they did called Trump Phobia: What Both
Mhm.
Sides Fear. And
Yeah.
we mediated 6 pairs of people at a impeached Trump rally the first time he was elected. And of the 5 pairs from coming from the left and the right, 5 of them gave each other hugs at the end
Yeah.
of the
Right.
circle. So that's kind of the power of the empathy. And in terms of becoming overwhelmed and with personal distress, I
Hmm.
think the more you do the active listening
Hmm.
and the more you practice, it kind of strengthens an internal, a certain internal grounding, or it's almost like an empathy battery. You get,
Right.
if you're have people haven't been listening to you and you're alone, you're kind of drained. You don't have the
Hmm.
capacity. But if a lot of people have been listening, maybe it's almost like attachment theory, that you've kind of become full. And I know that and even when we do these mediations, we have a pre-circle and a post-circle.
Right.
So before you go into this difficult situation, you have an empathy buddy that just listens to you about all your concerns, and then somebody that debriefs you, so you kind of build that internal sort of resilience
Hmm.
for dealing with those difficult situations.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be great to collect some data at the scientist in me says.
Would love
Uh,
to do an empathy if you want to do so.
y-
That's one of the things I'm hoping is that it
yeah,
can inspire academics like yourself to do some studies of the empathy circle. And
yeah,
actually, I
yeah.
just finished every Tuesday at 10 o'clock Pacific time. I meet with Jody. Um, what was her last name?
Jensen?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You know her, I guess. So,
Just from
oh, from the yeah.
videos.
So we
Yeah.
meet, and yeah, it's I hope I'm not getting Alzheimer's. But anyway, um, yeah, so we meet, and today we to talk about the definition. We probably had like 15 meetings so far, and we record them and post them and everything. And she was just talking about her personal distress that she's having.
Mm,
She's a real believer in empathy, and she tried to mediate a family conflict where there was like
mm.
a murder in the
Ooh,
family,
yeah.
and the family members were, kind of extended family members were really angry with each other, and she kind of just took it all on and kind of got into a burnout and
Hmm.
anxiety. And we're
Hmm.
meeting today, and she said, "Oh, I'm starting to feel a bit of that echo of
Hmm.
that anxiety." And I said, and we said, well, we could do an empathy circle next week. We're going to do an empathy circle in this time
Hmm.
frame, and you're welcome to take part if you want to.
Hmm.
It'll be at 10 o'clock next Tuesday.
Okay.
We'll go for an hour and a half. It's going to be about just what are personal concerns, anxieties, fears, that
Mhm.
you're kind of dealing with, so
Yeah.
we can so anyway, that the empathy circle can help regulate. I don't like that term regulate, but it can help sort of ground you, feel connected, feel heard, feel understood. Kind of, and even I did a little bit of active listening with her about her anxiety, and she could just feel that anxiety coming out and kind of
Mm,
feeling already better just by, a few minutes of
yeah,
being heard.
yeah, yeah. I think the listening in the context of the empathy circle, and I haven't been a part of one yet, which I'll have to do, but from what you're describing, it seems like it's got um, two other important pieces, which is like non-judgment, which is I know something Carl Rogers would often talk about, and coming along with that is like validation, and that's a piece of perceived responsiveness as well. So there's like care, understanding, and validation, and it seems like all of those. It's like a perfect practice for fostering perceived partner responsiveness. Is that you're communicating your care to them, you're perspective getting, you're reflecting your understanding back to them to make sure you've got it correctly, and then you're validating what they're feeling, at least in the sense that you're not immediately pushing back on what they're saying. They've got their time to say what they're saying. You're trying to understand uh, what they're feeling from their perspective and get a sense of what that is. Um, and I think doing this in like the political context, like you did, could be really powerful. Um, you'll often hear people say something like, I just can't understand how someone could A or B. Like, I just can't understand how someone could vote for Trump, or I just can't, and then they'll go from that, I can't understand. It's like the argument from ignorance, right? They'll go from that, I can't understand why this person would do this thing or hold this political belief to like, they must be a bad person or they must be dumb or something like that. But really, when you can't move from a position of not understanding to a judgment. You have to just stop there and say, I don't understand their perspective. And that's where, clearly you maybe have different information that you've been exposed to, different value, not necessarily different values, but different um, information, different feelings that you've had, different experiences, and that's sort of leading to you both having these different perspectives. Which, if you had their experiences and their exposure to information, that would seem reasonable. I think often, most of the time, people have reasonable beliefs for reasonable reasons from their past. And that's what you can uncover when you have this sort of conversation where you have non-judgmental, structured space for conversation where you're reflecting back. It's like steel manning
Yeah.
their perspective and not trying to like immediately undercut it. You're trying to like understand it from their perspective, and that can be really powerful. It sort of reminds me of some work by Luisa Santos on beliefs about cross-partisan empathy. You may be aware of this work, um, where they either told people that empathizing with the other side can be really effective, or empathizing with the other side can't be effective, or maybe they just didn't give the intervention. I don't remember exactly the details, but folks who were told that empathizing like across party lines can be effective,
Mm.
or is effective, they had less animosity towards people from the other party, and they also wrote more persuasive arguments for their own position, judged by a third party. So it wasn't that, people might fear that, if I'm empathetic with the other side, I'm going to maybe lose my ability to argue for my own side, or I'm going to lose my way or something like that. And that's not necessarily the case. It's just you you approach your attempt to show your own perspective with this sort of sense of shared humanity and uh, a respect and an understanding that the other person's perspective is valid as well. And it's more about finding common ground to convince them than it is about like showing them how ridiculous their position is, kind of thing,
Yeah,
which
that
doesn't tend
was
to be effective.
Jody's concern when she was listening to all these family members. She
Mm,
didn't, I don't, she did, wasn't getting heard and she lost herself,
mm,
So that's the other part of the empathy circle that you do have a chance when it's your turn to say, what you're saying is really ridiculous.
right.
you know, it's like, I totally disagree with what you're saying. So you have a space to share your own views,
Yeah.
and it will be met with empathy too,
Mm,
right?
mm,
That person is not going to immediately, attack you or dismiss you, that they will hear you out
mm,
for the time that you have. So, uh, And so anyway, I think that's the healthy part of it. That it's not like, and we have people a lot of times coming to the training. They say, in my family, I do all the listening to family
Hmm.
members, and nobody ever listens to me. So
Hmm.
empathy is bad because nobody, I'm doing all the empathizing and I'm getting burned out. And the
Yeah.
empathy circle brings it into the what I would call. In fact, I think that empathy, holistic empathy, is empathy. That the other parts are just parts or factions or facets
Hmm.
of empathy. So it's like empathy is you and I listening to each other is what empathy is. And if I weren't listening to you, then that would be an empathy deficit.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I know, yeah. So I think that mutuality. I don't know what you think about that. That empathy is a relationship, and it's the together the people in the community and the relationship all mutually empathizing with each other is what empathy is. And if somebody is not empathizing in the group, that's an empathy deficit.
Hmm.
For example, I just saw in Daryl Cameron, he does his
Yeah.
activating empathy, and he had Fritz Breithaupt, I think, who's like who I've interviewed, who
Hmm.
did the dark side of empathy, and he's
Right.
saying, well, empathy is you empathize with. There's two people in a conflict. Empathy is you will empathize with one side, and you will take their side,
Hmm.
right? And that's why empathy has this problem.
Hmm.
But that's defining it as an individualistic one direction. Whereas if empathy is all people, the three people in the group all
Hmm.
empathizing with each other, that's what empathy is. It's that
Hmm.
mutuality. It's a whole different picture at that point. At that picture
Hmm.
in the in if you're just empathizing with one person in that conflict, then there's an empathy deficit because you're not empathizing with the other person and they're not empathizing with each other.
Right.
So it takes it out of this. And I think that's one of the problems with the individualistic definition. It it creates it's ineffective. Empathy is so powerful, and for me it's like the hope for humanity,
Hmm.
and so I'm really trying to make the case for it, and having this individualistic definition is kind of a block to kind of
Hmm.
spreading this mutual holistic empathy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if I would say that like if if I'm only empathizing with one party in a conflict that like I would still consider that empathy, but I would consider it one-sided empathy or like incomplete empathy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so it's like those kind of experiments where they get people to empathize with someone who's on the donor list and then they'll move them up. But they don't get people to empathize with like the people that are then going to be moved down the list as a result. So I think you need to Bloom argues for like rational compassion is like you have to what I would say empathize with everybody that's going to be affected by your actions. And of course that can be challenging. Like Cameron's work shows, empathy can be effortful. Um, so it could be difficult, but I think it's sort of the onus is on us to empathize with everybody that might be affected by our actions or
And
by
for
what
them
it
to
is that we're doing.
empathize with you.
Right, right. Um, yeah, so I think that that makes sense. And I agree with the idea that you know, empathy is biased. That's a problem with empathy. Well, it might just be a problem of, not empathizing with everybody involved kind of thing. Um, so I think that makes sense. And
It's a
it seems to
problem
me,
with bias. It's
right,
not a problem
right,
with empathy, it's a problem with bias. Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, yeah, I agree with that.
And it's the same, and it's also the aspect, and that whole affective empathy, how to break that down. There seems to be two parts to it. One is the process of emotion sharing.
Mhm.
So if I'm listening to you, I'm sensing your emotions. Like I can see your head nodding, I can feel your concentration, your attention. Uh, but I'm not like overwhelmed with your feeling. I'm sort of sensing into, and I
Mhm.
hear your thoughts, and I could reflect your thoughts as well. So
Mhm.
I'm it, so that seems to be part of the affective empathy is what is happening with the feelings that are coming across from you. Am
Right.
I taking those on and totally becoming overwhelmed with them with, like, which is what, Paul Bloom seems to be criticizing is, emotions. So you're angry, so I get angry too. And so,
Hmm.
and like that is for me is actually block to empathy. So what he's
Hmm.
actually talking about is a block to empathy. It's not empathy.
Hmm.
And so, and then the other part is with F under the category of effective empathy is reactions to
Hmm.
empathy. It's
Hmm.
like the personal distress or empathic distress. Is it, feeling sorry for someone, sympathy? So it seems like those two categories fit under affective empathy and
Hmm.
just how the emotions, happen between the sensing of emotion and its self-other distinction. Like, I think that needs a lot of exploration. It's very murky, and I think that's why Paul Bloom could step into that murkiness and be so have all his criticisms as well as the reactions. The reactions I don't think are empathy. The reactions usually tend to be blocks to empathy. Personal distress blocks empathy.
Hmm.
Feeling sorry for the person can block empathy. So it's the staying present with someone and sensing into them and not being distracted by your reactions,
Hmm.
even though you might have reactions in the background which you can't help, but
Hmm.
still maintaining the main sense of presence and attention with the other person. For me, is what the empathy part is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think I mostly just disagree with the definition of empathy that Bloom employs, but I think he's got a lot of if you think about it as sharing the negative emotions of other people, there are concerns associated with that. Um, anyway, uh,
Well, I could answer that if sharing in terms of negative emotions, that's where the
mm,
reflection comes in.
mhm.
By staying present with someone and just reflecting their negative emotions, you don't take them on so much because
Yes,
it's like, I know it's your emotions, it's not my emotions. So it
right,
helps with the self-other distinction.
right, right,
So, and then, but he's saying that you go to your therapist and you're totally angry, you're totally a mess and chaotic and, just, whatever in distress or whatever. And then your therapist becomes distressed,
right, right.
right? And then they stop being your therapist at that point. They're no longer being present. And it can
Mhm.
actually be, I think people like Rosenberg, they talk about Marshall Rosenberg with the NBC about being present with some. You can actually enjoy somebody's distress because it's your distress. I'm here. I'm being present. I'm contributing to you by hearing your distress, which is alleviating, the sorrows shared or sorrows halved, kind of,
Yeah, yeah.
you know,
A
model.
sorrow shared is a sorrow halved, and a joy shared is a joy multiplied,
Double.
or
Yeah,
something like
exactly.
a doubled. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, which I also like sort of underscores this idea of regulating emotion sharing based on the valence of the emotion. So um, yeah, I think that that's definitely a valuable practice.
You were talking about, I think you were talking about Bloom and or
Yeah.
cut you off there.
Oh no, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think just a lot of that just comes down to how we define empathy again. And if we do define it in that way, and so you're saying, feeling what others are feeling, and then like losing that self-other distinction, that's actually a block to empathy.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and sort of from your perspective, empathy is like getting to that state where you're not only do you feel or not only do you like understand the other person and sense into their worldview, you communicate that to them in a way that feels true to them and feels validating to them. Um, so that's sort of like, to me, that's like empathy that's been regulated effectively and communicated effectively and received well.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think
And
that
that's what you're
that's.
looking at too, right? You're looking at what the effect on the empathizer and the receiver of the
Mhm. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, I'm doing that, and some folks have done that, but not a lot of work in the empathy space has looked at that yet. There's actually like some stuff on with AI that's starting to do that as well. So like there's all sorts of discussion about how, AI can come out with empathic sounding text in response to what people say. And for some people, that can be like a source of support for them. Um, and of course, there's lots of folks that say, well, that's not really empathy, and of course, in some sense, it's not. Um, but if you focus on the receiver and you think about like the best possible alternative in a lot of cases, there's a lot of people who don't have close friends. They don't have people that they can talk to. And if the best possible alternative is to go to a stranger in a chat room or on a forum and say, this is how I'm feeling, and hope that somebody responds in a supportive way, um, you might get better results talking to an AI chatbot than that. If the best possible alternative is to go to a close friend or to go to your therapist and speak with them in person and engage, or an empathy circle, I think you're going to get better results with that. But yeah, it's interesting to look at how sort of the large language models come up with empathic responses, and how it people people will rate those as more empathic and feeling more heard um, than like a human generated response. But if you take AI generated responses and you say this one's made by an AI versus this one's made by a human, they prefer the one that was labeled as human. And if you ask them, do you want a response from an AI or a response from a human, they tend to prefer the human response and will select it like 40% of the time, even if they have to wait 2 weeks to hear from a human. Um, so people seem to prefer they want to be heard from a human, but often what the AI generates in text form. And there's a difference between, text communication and in-person communication, where I think a lot is lost, and
mm,
those studies haven't been done where it's like comparing, come in and speak with someone in person, or talk to a friend in person and rate their quality of empathy and how heard you feel and things like that versus getting a text response from an AI. Um, but again, if you think about best possible alternatives and you're comparing it to a chat exchange with another human, which in some ways really stacks the deck against the humans, but you can also look at like what they do in those responses and how it's different from what a human generates. And that can be instructive to like help humans empathize better. So one of the things that they do is they validate. One thing that came up for me is you talk about, there's space to say, well, what you're saying like doesn't make sense to me, or it's ridiculous. And that is met with empathy as well. And that sort of AIs have this problem of like sycophancy, like
mhm.
they'll over agree with everything you say. They validate to an extreme. So, even to the point of like if you're like, oh, I feel so overwhelmed, like I want to jump off a bridge, and like they'll be like, yeah, like, I can, you know, uh they won't necessarily be like, oh, like you shouldn't do that. You should, I can totally understand feeling overwhelmed, but I wouldn't do that. Like they'll just be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like that you would want to do that. And, they don't push back where you need to push back. But they do, that's obviously quite an extreme emotion, and that would require like a therapist, but in more, or, suicide hotline and someone who's trained, or, human intervention in some way. Um, but with the more like kind of mundane, like, oh, I had a rough day, my boss was kind of rude to me today, and things like that. Um, what they don't do is they don't offer like personal insights from their own life that will make it all better right now, which is something that humans are often trying to do. So you talk about, creating space, giving time, not judging their emotions or trying to change their emotions while they're speaking in the empathy circle. And, that's what people often want, is like, I'm feeling negative. I don't necessarily, yes, I want to feel better at some point, but I don't, there's often nothing that someone can say that's going to make that person feel better right there because they said the right magic words, right? It's about just being present and giving them time to, have that self-empathy experience where they're uh, getting a deeper understanding of what they're feeling. And that allows them to work through it over time, kind of thing, as opposed to, you know, sending the right message that's just going to be like, oh, now I feel enlightened and I immediately feel better. Uh, and that's often what people are trying to do is like get people out of that negative emotion right away, give
Mm-hmm.
them the insight from their own life. So there's sort of some of those differences that can be instructive into how we can empathize better, I think. So
Have you been working on that with the AI, or is that just something you've been reading about? Or
mostly just reading about. I
Mhm.
am looking at maybe doing some studies with that, but where I've been kind of writing these papers on like empathy from the receiver perspective and like perceived responsiveness, I've been sort of reading that literature on uh, because it's hasn't been looked at a lot. But one place that they're looking at it, obviously, you can't have an intrapersonal perspective on empathy with large language models because they don't have their own subjective interpersonal experience, right? So the only place you can focus in that space is on the receiver. So that's where some of that work has been going on, and of course, it's like a hot area these days. Um, yeah, so.
so you're looking at what is the receiver's experience of receiving empathy, and how are you looking at that? What
Yeah,
Could you explore that?
yeah. So in the context that I'm looking at right now, it's been like the dyadic studies that I mentioned briefly. So, having people come into the lab and they like brainstorm for 2 minutes about either like a meaningful negative experience in one study or a meaningful positive experience in another study. And then they have a 4 minute conversation that's recorded. And they, talk about their negative event or their meaningful positive event with the other person. And we get different like trait and state empathy measures of the listener. So things like co-experience positive affect. So after the conversation, they then watch the conversation and they use a dial to rate how they're feeling and how they think the other person was feeling. And so you can sort of combine those ratings from the two people to see, okay, like here they're both feeling positive at the same time. And you might think about that as like feeling the positive emotions the other person's feeling, or positive emotion sharing, co-experience positive affect, whatever you want to call it. You can also look at like, okay, this person uh, they rated the other person as feeling this, and this is where the other person rated themselves. So like you get a sense of the accuracy of the person. And is it about accuracy that makes the person feel they were responsive? That does it make them feel cared for, understood, and validated? Or is it about um, how compassionate the other person was that makes them feel they were responsive? Um, so there's sort of you can look at which different dimensions of empathy are making that person feel uh, responded to appropriately, empathized with. Um, so it's sort of bridging like the relationships literature and the empathy literature in that way. Um, yeah, and it seems to be that when they're disclosing a negative event, compassion is like the key dimension of empathy that predicts that the person is seen as responsive. So the more that I either rate that I felt compassion myself, or the more that the other person rates me as being compassionate throughout the conversation, then the more that they're going to say that I was a responsive partner after the interaction. Um, and same when then we switch roles and I'm the sharer and they're the listener. How compassionate they are is going to drive how much I think that they were responsive. And then on the positive side, it seems to be like how much do they experience my positive affect with me seems to drive that responsiveness. Um, so yeah, that's what I've been kind of
Mm.
looking at lately.
Mm.
Yeah.
And there's also, I think I saw something you're doing um, experience in everyday life. Is that part of that, or is that different?
Yeah, that was like kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of the ways that I think about this. So that was where I ping people 7 times a day for a week. And I ask them, in the last 15 minutes, have you had an opportunity to empathize with another person? And, about what, I think like 19% of the time they'd say yes. And 88% of the time they'd say they actually experienced empathy. And, 75% of that time they had all three of those pieces coming together: emotion sharing, perspective taking, and compassion. Um, and that's also where I found that, through the empathy opportunities for positive emotions were 3 times as common as empathy opportunities for negative emotions. And people are often empathizing with close others, not total strangers. So when we have folks come into the lab and we study empathy as a response to the negative emotions of a stranger, that's actually like a minority of what everyday experiences of empathy look like. Um, yeah. And these experiences are associated with better well-being for the empathizer and pretty highly predictive of pro-social behavior as well. So doing something to help another person or make them feel better. Um, yeah.
And where do you see your work going?
Yeah.
The longer term?
Yeah. So I think one line of work that I'm doing is like interventions to improve wise empathy. So teaching people to regulate their emotion sharing, sort of like what I've been talking about, telling them, when you when you engage with positive emotions of other people, feel appreciative joy for them. Don't make social comparisons. Celebrate their positive emotions. And this has been so far in the context of social media. So when you're coming across different posts, so it's not necessarily in the context of a conversation. I'd like to go to medical practitioners is where I'm looking next. So that's more of like this interpersonal, and there I want to tap the patient perspective as well. Um, so teaching doctors to uh, so one thing that's kind of interesting is that doctors, when you ask them what empathy involves, they'll say, it involves like feeling the negative emotions that that the patient is feeling. But patients will say it's about like showing care. So more like, yeah, we'll say showing care. Um, so if we can get doctors maybe to regulate their emotion sharing, focus on compassion for the patient when they're feeling negative emotions, and feel free to celebrate and share the positive emotions of patients and family when those arise as well. Um, like Michael Andrewchick had a paper where it's like feeling your joy helps me to bear feeling your sadness kind of thing. Um, so yeah, and then along with that regulation of the affective empathy or the emotion sharing, I usually say, because as you say, like affective empathy has all sorts of different things that it could mean. But if I say feeling what the other person feels while maintaining a self-other distinction, I agree that self-other distinction gets really muddled. It's like, at what point, okay, I'm sharing your sadness and I sort of recognize that it's your sadness, that it is the source of it. But like, at what point does your sadness like become my sadness? Like I'm feeling it, but it's your emotion I'm feeling. What does that really mean? And I do think that the concept is useful and like, um, but it does become a bit fuzzy to me in some ways. But in any case, having people regulate that vicarious emotion feel bivalent. So crank it up when it's positive, share what they're feeling, celebrate it, appreciative joy rather than social comparisons. Dial it down when it's negative, when they're suffering. Focus on compassion. Don't leave the situation, but recognize and accept that you're feeling what they're feeling, but focus on compassion for the other person and being present um, to help them in that way. Um, and then so yeah, I want to move that to different contexts. So I've done two studies now. Well, two papers. One had four studies, and one is a more like experience sampling study with social media users. Next, I want to look at youth on social media because that's really like a critical age window for effects of social media. And then the other sort of line is to look at medical practitioners because they have really high levels of burnout and issues with well-being. And I'm hoping that this can help with some of those aspects. I know that there's parts of the job that wise empathy won't help, like just being overworked, too much paperwork and things like that. It's not going to help with, but I'm hoping that if they can engage more wisely with their patient emotions, it can improve well-being and reduce burnout. And then I think a third sort of direction is like continuing to look at the receiver of empathy. And if we do these wise empathy interventions, and I'm saying it's morally grounded and it's about the empathizer and the target of empathy, um, then is it actually benefiting the target when we give these interventions? So the data I've seen now or am writing up now shows that positive emotion sharing and compassion drive responsiveness in these contexts, as that perspective would suggest. But if I actually give these interventions to folks, does it result in benefits? Doing that sort of experimental manipulation. So those are like three uh, near-term sort of directions that I'm looking at in the future.
We get a lot of feedback on the experience of taking part in an empathy circle.
Yeah.
Like we're doing, we have a empathy summit. We do every 3, 4 months on the empathy circle, and then we're starting a series on how to build the empathy movement. So
Hmm.
if you ever want to be a speaker on that, any ideas on how to build a movement to
Cool.
make mutual empathy a cultural value.
Hmm.
And I just one person who's speaking at the Empathy Circle summit. She just talks about how it changed her life. She's a was a student at UC Berkeley and
Hmm.
actually started an empathy student-led class there that they did for multiple years. And
Oh,
we went
cool.
with the empathy tent and did empathy circles with them, and out on Sprout Plaza, and she's going to be talking about how it changed her life. The empathy circle changed her life, and how she uses the sort of the mindset of the empathy circle with her family and in her work
Hmm.
too. So there's tons of just stories that people tell about the experience. So it's not, yeah, it's more anecdotal, or qualitative.
Yeah.
So um, there's
That's
that part. And then another goal is to teach everyone in the world how to take part in an empathy circle,
yeah.
and trying to get this definition, what the holistic empathy definition model together, grounded in the empathy circle as a practical tool, so
Hmm.
that the definition of empathy can be more practical. You can understand what's happening in the empathy circle. And I see it as sort of a first step gateway practice. There's a lot
Hmm.
you can add to it, like all the interventions you're talking about, but
Hmm.
it's the simplest first step gateway practice that it's like you do 20% of the work, you get 80% of the benefit kind of,
Right. Right.
situation. And so trying to spread that together with the definition, and then to address I mean, you've probably seen all the criticisms of empathy, everything from
Hmm.
Elon Musk to, the book on toxic empathy and like suicidal empathy, it's just like,
Hmm.
and so to be able to have a clear definition to be able to address those criticisms. And I've reached out to all of them, the writers, and they won't talk to me. So same with
Yeah.
Paul Bloom. We did an email exchange, but he wouldn't do a recorded, discussion. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I did one with someone who wrote about what he called radical empathy, and he was at the University of Chicago, and he's
Hmm.
very critical of empathy, but
Hmm.
seeing it as a sort of a gateway to victimhood and
Hmm.
sort of woke activism. So,
Hmm.
and he felt, it was sort of an authoritarian approach. And
Hmm.
with the discussion, I was able to show the that empathy is the exit to the drama triangle. Drama triangle is, if you're familiar with it, I don't know if you've heard of it in mediation. It's
Hmm.
the it's the it's the victim, perpetrator, rescuer dynamic
Okay.
that in you see someone who's a victim, and you have a perpetrator, hurting the victim, and
Right.
then you rescue the victim, and in the
Right.
process you become a perpetrator because you're
Mm.
you're you're creating, you're sort of attacking the perpetrator, and then the
Right.
perpetrator sees themselves as the victim, and the roles keep changing. And
Right.
it's kind of like our culture. It's almost a model of our culture. Everybody, Trump sees himself as a victim. The woke see people as victims, and it's just like everybody, and they're going to rescue, or they're the perpetrator, or it's a big mess. And the
Yeah.
the empathy circle I see is the exit to that, because if you have, instead of trying to rescue someone, you listen to both sides,
Hmm.
and you try to bring them into listening to you, and for them to listen to each other
Hmm.
empathically. And that's what we do with the conflict mediation, right? Is
Mm.
you listen to the parties, and then you try to get them to listen to each other, empathize basically with each other, and you create an empathic kind of a holistic empathic relationship. And
Right.
people can work out their differences if they can slow down enough to listen to each other, is my experience over and over again.
Mhm.
And so anyway, it's being able to address those criticisms, of
Yeah.
empathy. One of them is the victim perpetrator, that dynamic. There's a lot of other criticisms too, but
Right. Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. That's something that like Kurt Gray talks about in his book Outraged is like people mostly have this like harm-based perspective on morality, and most people agree that we should try to lessen harm, but people often disagree on like who is being harmed and who's the victim and who's the perpetrator kind of thing. So that's really
yeah,
interesting.
and you listen to both sides and you try to get them to listen to each other, then they kind of are able to work out, uh,
Mhm.
get past that, yeah, that
Yeah.
mindset.
That also brings up for me this kind of interesting finding that like empathic concern can be associated with political polarization. So people who have very high levels of empathic concern, uh, they can be sensitive to the harms of people in their in-group. And that can make them especially polarized. Is like, these other people are harming folks that I'm quite concerned about. And so I'm very like, I become more polarized kind of thing. So if you can have a more sort of holistic empathy perspective, that might be a way to get out of that,
Yeah,
being
you're
pushed.
talking about the victim perpetrator dynamic
Yeah, yeah,
with that,
exactly.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
anyway, with that one person, I did talk to him about it because he had that mindset, and I
Mhm.
convinced him to do some empathy circles, and
Nice.
and because I mean, and I've had the experience. I mean, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's like progressives that are the empathic," but at these events and demonstrations, if I find that if you can show conservatives what empathy is, they're all for it. It's like it's me being heard and me listening
Mhm.
to others, so they're very supportive of it if you can get people into the process. And we've done that where um, we went to uh, pro right wing rallies when Trump was first elected the first time around,
Mhm.
and we had we're just offering listening to the people there. And then five Identity Europa guys came over, and they're the ones that were like carrying the tiki torches at,
Mhm.
Charlottesville. And
Yeah.
they came into it, to the tent. And my friend was talking with a couple, and the topic came up about the Holocaust.
Mhm.
And then I said, "Oh, well, we do empathy circles here," and we kind of showed him how to do it. And then he spoke, and my friend, Dave, reflected back what he was saying about the Holocaust. And then he said, "Well, the Holocaust to me means that he's Jewish. So half my family were killed in Austria, and the other half were spread around the world."
Mhm.
And the guy just couldn't reflect it. He just didn't want to say what he heard. And about four times, my friend just repeated it until that guy's friend said, "Just tell him what you heard him say." And he finally reflected back, half your family were killed, and the
Yeah.
other half were, spread around the world. Because he
Mhm.
was like making up. You can just see him in his head trying to not say it. Say, "Well, it's the
Yeah.
communists. It was this. It was this.
Mhm.
It was when
Mhm.
they didn't really Jews weren't really killed or
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
have you." But then my friend could just said that when he said he could feel just the difference it made him feel that the person really heard him instead of having
Yeah.
that wall up.
Mhm.
And that's part of the mediation,
Mhm.
the political mediation. So
Right. Right. Yeah, it can be threatening to take on other people's perspectives, especially if it makes us feel that actions we've taken or other thoughts that we had, um, makes us feel like it bad. It makes us feel
mhm,
like we've done something wrong or harmful. Because again, we most of the time, most of us want to reduce harm and are concerned about harm. So
yeah.
yeah.
Well, we talked about the empathy circle. If you're interested in taking part in empathy circle, we're going to be doing another one next week, and you could meet Jody, who's working on her PhD on empathy at BYU. So
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm not sure if I can come next week, but I definitely would like to participate. I'll check my.
Find another time that works. If you have some
Yeah,
times, just let me know. We can make another arrangement for another
yeah, that would be
circle.
great. I think that would be super interesting and useful for me. So,
Yeah, well, thanks for the discussion. I've been wanting to sort of test the holistic empathy model, so I'm kind of, I mean, it seemed I got I felt like pretty positive response to to it.
yeah.
Like I didn't hear any major criticisms, and I'm looking for criticisms like, hey, am I wrong around this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could have a different conversation where we're just like quibbling over what empathy means or not, or how you should define it. But that's like, uh, I mean, it is super important, and maybe that's a discussion we should have moving forward, where like, but I think that the construct that you're doing it and the way that you're defining empathy is really useful. So even I think that having a interpersonal perspective is also scientifically useful. Like I think the holistic empathy perspective is very practically useful, and it makes a lot of sense, and it addresses a lot of blind spots that are in the empathy literature. Um, I, and then I think, from another unit of analysis, for example, like when you're looking at folks that are engaging with the emotions of other people on social media and they're not interacting with them in person, like how do they then engage with that? I see, that's also empathy. And so we could
Hmm.
define it this other way. So,
Right.
yeah, so I see like trying to come to like a shared understanding is more interesting to me, and like advance the concept is more interesting to me than like no, this is the proper way to define empathy versus this is the proper way to define empathy. Um, but at the same time, we have to have a shared language. Um, and oftentimes even people either won't define empathy in like academic work, or they'll define it one way and measure it a different way,
Yeah,
or define it one
I've
way
seen
and use
that.
it a different
Yeah.
way. So it can be a really messy in that way. But
Well, when
uh,
I talked to Dan Batson, he says,
mhm.
it's all these, he laid out like 8 different
Yeah,
definitions. He said, what you have to do is you have to be really clear on how you're defining it and then stick with it. So,
yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
that's what I'm trying to do is just be really clear and also that it's functional within the context of the empathy circle, which I just see as a first step, sort of gateway practice. It's easy. People can get started and if people do like empathy circles at home or with their friends or their colleagues, I mean, it can change your life.
Mhm.
It brings you into sort of that empathic mindset. So
Mhm.
it's just yeah, from I don't know 15 years of working on this, it seems like
Mhm.
the easiest first step. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great starting point, and it moves the field in some good ways for sure.
Well, I'm glad to chat any other time too if you want to get
Yeah,
together. If there's
yeah,
others too who just want to kind of explore the topic or glad
yeah,
to
that would be great.
do
I'd love
that and do the
to keep the
empathies.
combo
Yeah.
going.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Great.
Great to meet you, Edwin.
Yeah. Good to meet you too. And
Yeah,
keep up the work. And I think you're at. I think there's yeah. UC San Diego has that big center. They had like $100 million or something. To Stanford or some
yeah, the
Stan
Sanford Center for
Stanford.
Empathy and Compassion, or the
Yeah.
Sanford Institute. Sorry, yeah.
Mhm.
Actually, they're supporting my work here.
Oh,
They're one
good.
of them and Shirk, the Canadian government. So yeah,
Nice.
yeah, it's great. Yeah, they're awesome.
Well, maybe we can do some empathy circles with you and I can hold one. Just let me know some times that work for you, and I'll get some others. You can, if you want to invite someone, maybe we can do some with your group there too, so they can experience it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, we'll have to organize that.
Okay, well, great. Well,
All right.
thanks for the discussion, Gregory.
Thank you, Edwin. Have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye.